Okay, let's dive into the sources you've shared with us today. We've got a stack of recent reporting here, all circling around some really critical issues.
Yeah, things like drug trafficking, national security, and some law enforcement challenges that seem to be impacting both Canada and the United States.
That's right. So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack the claims, maybe the connections, and some of the, well, perhaps unexpected details buried in these articles.
Exactly. We want to help you cut through some of the noise and hopefully get a clearer picture of what's being reported right now on these uh, pretty complex fronts.
Yeah, these sources, they don't really pull any punches. They hint at some pretty significant stuff,
Mm-hmm.
like allegations of investigations being blocked, potential links between drug networks, and even, yeah, terror.
And then there's this surprising look at public opinion on drug policy, which might challenge some common assumptions you hear.
Definitely. So let's get into it. Where do these sources take us first? Let's maybe start by unpacking this major carfentanil seizure. This happened in Pickering, Ontario, back in 2017.
Right, and we're talking about an absolutely massive amount here, 42 kilograms of confirmed carfentanil,
Wow.
part of a 53-kilogram seizure overall. The reporting you share notes this was like the largest in Canadian history at the time.
And here's where the reporting links it to something incredibly sensitive. The sources seem to connect this specific seizure to the brother of Faisal Hussein.
Yeah, the individual responsible for the 2018 Danforth Avenue mass shooting in Toronto. That's a very significant connection being made.
It is. And this is also where one of the sources brings in the perspective of a former top U.S. DEA official, Donald M.
Right, he led their Special Operations Division.
And M makes some pretty stark claims, basically saying the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, wanted samples of that seized carfentanil.
Why? Well, to test its molecular structure, apparently, and potentially link it to seizures happening south of the border.
Yeah, specifically mentioning overdoses down in Atlanta,
Yeah.
traced back to a Canadian supplier named Arden McCann.
And the really significant claim I'm makes, at least as reported in the sources, is that Canadian authorities, identified specifically as senior bureaucrats and individuals at RCMP headquarters, that's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police,
Okay.
allegedly blocked these DEA requests
Locked them completely.
for both the samples and broader information. Yeah, and this was despite the sources noting that, some mid-level RCMP officers were reportedly willing to cooperate.
So the DEA, understandably viewed this seizure with extreme seriousness.
You have to, right? When you consider the potency, carfentanil, as little as 20 micrograms can be fatal.
Right.
So 1 kilogram could theoretically yield millions of lethal doses.
In 42 kilograms confirmed seized. In theory, that's enough potency to, deliver a lethal dose to the entire populations of both Canada and the United States.
It's staggering. So the DEA clearly saw this as a massive threat, possibly one targeting the U.S.
What's really fascinating here, though, according to Iam's statements in the source, are the potential international links the DEA was investigating beyond just Canada-U.S.
Yeah, while there was like a clear assumption of links to China for precursor chemicals, I'm actually stated, not only did we assume there were links to China, but then we found links back to Pakistan.
Pakistan.
Yeah. He added, and I can't disclose exactly what, but it's bad. He later clarified these were apparently indirect links to terror networks.
Wow. Okay, and circling back to China for a sec, U.S. officials, as reported, believed the chemicals, the food dyes found at the scene, the gear,
Right, the chemical handling gear.
it likely originated there, in China. They connected this back to Chinese chemical firms that U.S. officials see as state-tolerated.
And M himself has actually testified before the U.S. Congress about alleged Chinese Communist Party involvement in, subsidizing these precursor chemicals.
So this leads to a critical point the DEA was concerned about: potential terror implications.
Right. The sources note that despite the official Canadian narrative at the time focusing on, mental health and family hardship for the Danforth shooter, and Canadian law enforcement dismissing ISIS's claim of responsibility for that shooting, M states the DEA remained concerned that the carfentanil could potentially be used as a weapon.
A weapon of mass destruction. That's the term used.
Exactly. That was their concern, linking back potentially to that ISIS claim, even if dismissed elsewhere.
And details from the scene itself also seem significant to the DEA, according to M in the sources.
Yeah, things like the large quantity of food dye and that specialized chemical handling gear.
What was the theory there?
Well, The theory, as Anne presented it, was that the food dye was maybe intended for marketing the drug to youth, but maybe the process failed.
Okay.
But just the sheer presence of all this gear suggested either commercial scale production or distribution,
What?
or, as the DEA considered, preparation for something potentially terror-related.
Right. And the legal outcome for the homeowner, Mason Ansari. The sources mentioned that too.
Yeah, convicted, sentenced to 20 years. This was for firearms and 26 kilograms of carfentanil possession for trafficking.
But released on bail, pending appeal.
Interestingly, yes. And the court ruling, cited in the source, noted he was seen as, quote, a necessary cog in a larger operation.
So pulling this first section together then, what does this all mean, according to these sources?
Well, it seems this specific case is kind of a focal point for escalating U.S. concerns.
Right. The reporting you shared describes anxieties about Canada's perceived role in the fentanyl supply chain, allegations of maybe declining enforcement standards.
And what U.S. officials apparently term political resistance to cooperation. Senior U.S. officials are quoted alleging, repeated stonewalling on fentanyl investigations.
Including identifying super labs, these large-scale clandestine labs, and distribution networks across Canada.
Yeah, and the sources describe intelligence often flowing only from the DEA to Canada, which reflects what these officials call long-standing frustrations.
Okay, so that's one major thread. Let's maybe connect this specific, deeply concerning case to a broader picture painted by another source you provided.
Right. According to a recent report, this one dated May 18th, 2025, the director of the U.S. FBI, Kash Patel, made some very pointed allegations.
What did he claim?
Patel claims there's a newly sort of solidified axis of criminal cooperation.
An axis between who?
He alleges it exists between Mexican cartels, operatives linked to the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, and Iranian threat actors.
Wow. Mexican cartels, CCP operatives, and Iranian actors cooperating.
That's the allegation. And the assertion made in that reporting is that these groups are specifically using Canada's northern border and the Port of Vancouver as their preferred entry points.
For what?
For both fentanyl and, significantly, terror suspects trying to get into the United States. Patel reportedly contrasted this sharply with the U.S. southern border, which he described in the interview as, quote, sealed.
Okay, so pointing the finger north. This echoes reporting from the Bureau as well, right? The publication cited in one of the sources.
Yeah, they use the term criminal convergence to describe these networks allegedly operating across multiple Canadian provinces.
And the sources point to a specific event as a recent example.
They do. The dismantling of a fentanyl super laboratory in Falkland, British Columbia. That was back in October 2024.
And this lab, according to the sources, is allegedly linked
to sanction Chinese chemical exporters, Iranian threat actors, and Mexican cartel operatives, all potentially connected to that one lab.
So Patel is quoted highlighting two specific factors that allegedly enable this flow.
Right. One, the sheer tyranny of distance of the northern border, just how vast and hard to police it is.
Makes sense.
And two, what he called lax enforcement in Canada.
Strong words. Did he offer any data?
He cited a specific statistic from the source. Over 300 known or suspected terrorists allegedly crossed illegally into the U.S. last year. And according to Patel and the source, a significant majority, 85%, supposedly came via the northern border.
85%. That's quite a claim.
Yeah.
The sources note that Patel's comments appeared designed to, turn up the political pressure on Canada.
It seems that way. The reporting explicitly contrasts Canada's level of cooperation unfavorably with that of Mexico, according to Patel's reported view.
Okay, so why does this reporting about this broader criminal convergence matter to you listening?
Well, it paints a picture, doesn't it, of a complex, interconnected global criminal landscape that is allegedly exploiting vulnerabilities right here in North America.
Yeah, these claims raise some pretty significant questions about border security for both countries and the state of international cooperation between key allies.
Definitely.
Okay. We've looked at alleged enforcement challenges, claims of international criminal networks using Canada. Now let's shift gears slightly. There's another fascinating piece in the sources you provided, touching on a debate about drug policy within Canada itself.
Right. And the core question being explored in this particular piece is whether drug prohibition, the very act of making drugs illegal, is inherently racist.
Okay. And the sources present arguments from some organizations they term left-wing institutions. What do they argue?
Well, these arguments claim that drug prohibition is, deeply rooted in a history of racism, white supremacy, colonialism, and discriminatory enforcement patterns against minority communities over time.
Right. That's an argument you sometimes hear. But here's where the source presents a counter-narrative that might be, well, surprising to some.
Yeah, this view is directly challenged by looking at history outside of Western nations. The article points to historical examples of non-European societies banning drugs long before, significant Western influence.
Not quite.
Look, things like Sharia law,
Yeah.
certain historical indigenous treaties, or policies in the Qing Empire in China. It also contrasts this with modern drug enforcement policies in many Asian and Muslim countries today,
Which are often.
often far stricter than what we see in the West.
Interesting. The article then highlights a trend suggested by recent polling and election results, both in Canada and the U.S.
Yeah, it indicates that racial minorities might actually be increasingly pushing back against more permissive drug policies.
Really? What examples do they give?
The source provides examples like Asian support against a progressive district attorney in San Francisco, Latino support for stricter penalties in California,
Okay.
and non-white and South Asian support for tough-on-crime conservative candidates in recent Canadian elections.
So to explore this further, the source details specific data from a pretty large poll.
Yeah, conducted by the Center for Responsible Drug Policy and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It was a significant sample, over 12,000 British Columbians surveyed.
Including a substantial number of non-white respondents.
That's right, 2,233 non-white respondents were included.
Okay, so what do they find when they ask people flat out? Is criminalizing drugs racist?
According to this poll data, only 26% of the non-white respondents agreed with that statement.
Only 26%.
Right, while a clear majority, 56%, disagreed. Wow. And Indigenous respondents were apparently even more likely to disagree, at 61%. Across many of the minority groups surveyed in BC, disagreement was stronger than agreement on that question.
So what's the takeaway for you from this specific poll data?
Well, look, it's focused on British Columbia, one province, but the sample size is significant.
Yeah.
And it suggests that the narrative you sometimes hear that racial minorities universally view drug criminalization as inherently racist, well, it might not accurately reflect the actual range of opinions within those communities, at least in this context.
It certainly challenges some widely held assumptions in the drug policy debate.
It does.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the sources you shared. We started with those really serious allegations surrounding the Toronto carfentanil seizure.
Right, including claims from that former DEA official, Don Im, about blocked U.S. investigations and the potential terror links his agency was exploring.
And then we moved to the reporting on alleged criminal convergence claims from the FBI director about Canada's northern border potentially being exploited by dangerous networks.
Networks involving groups allegedly from Mexico, China, and Iran.
Yeah. And finally, we looked at the debate around drug criminalization itself, and that surprising poll data suggesting that, at least in one large Canadian province, minority communities might not universally agree with the argument that prohibition is inherently racist.
Yeah. Collectively, these sources really paint a picture of a complex, interconnected challenge. It's clearly not just about domestic drug issues, is it?
No, it involves global criminal networks operating across borders, raising pretty significant national security concerns.
And highlighting apparent points of tension and, frankly, mistrust in international law enforcement cooperation, at least as described by the U.S. officials cited in these sources.
The implications discussed, they range from potential economic consequences, like the possibility of tariffs Don mentioned in the context of U.S.-Canada relations, to just the clear need for better coordination, all while acknowledging this ongoing mistrust between some U.S. and Canadian agencies, again, as described by those U.S. officials.
It's a lot to take in.
That really was quite the deep dive into these sources you provided. We've covered the serious allegations around that Toronto carfentanil seizure, the claims about Canada's northern border potentially acting as a pipeline for dangerous networks, and that unexpected poll data on minority perspectives on drug laws in BC.
Yeah, thank you for bringing these articles to our attention. They certainly highlight the intricate and sometimes hidden aspects of global crime, national security, and the sheer complexities of public policy debates.
It definitely does. And this raises, I think, an important question for you to consider as you think about all this information. Given the complexity and the, frankly, differing accounts presented in these reports, everything from alleged official stonewalling and international criminal convergence, to these varied community viewpoints on drug policy. How does a society effectively address such multifaceted challenges? Challenges that span borders and involve national security, public health, and diverse community perspectives.